Now, it was probably the last chance we'll get to see Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt on a stage together, debating quite like that, arguing over which of them is best placed to run the country. The two candidates went head-to-head for an hour last night on a programme called Britain's Next Prime Minister, the ITV debate. Of course, there was a lot of talking over one another.
It was part of a package.
Boris, it was a mistake.
It was
part
of a package.
Tax cuts
Please,
for the
thank you.
rich.
I'm talking to Julie.
I have spent my life trying to persuade people that we are not the party of the rich.
There were differences of opinion over whether to suspend Parliament if it tries to stop a no-deal Brexit.
When that's happened in the past, when Parliament's been shut down against its will, we've actually had a civil war. And I think it would be a rather curious thing to do if this is about taking back control for Parliament to actually shut it down. So my answer to that is no. How about you, Boris?
Well, I'm not going to take anything off the table any more than I'm going to take no deal
so no answer.
off the table.
And they were asked if Sir Kim Darroch should keep his job as US ambassador if they became Prime Minister.
I will keep him until he's due to retire,
OK.
And I think we'd like to know if you would.
Well, I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to
Thank
think
you.
that I'm
OK.
going to be in a position
Let's go
to
back.
take that. But what I will say is that I and I alone will decide who takes important and politically sensitive jobs, such as the UK ambassador to the US.
Thank you.
And we will do it that way.
Thank you, Mr.
Some clips there, some highlights, if you will, from last night's debate. Let's talk now to two political commentators, Isabel Hardman from The Spectator, Tom Harwood from the Guido Fawkes website. Good morning to both of you.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Did you have popcorn last night? Did you enjoy it immensely?
Oh God, I watched it on catch-up actually, so I wasn't this avid looker at it, but I don't think it really deserved popcorn, to be quite honest.
Really? So your snap verdict then on
Snap
last night?
verdict is nothing has changed in those immortal words.
You don't think you learned anything?
I think we learnt nothing new. I don't think the dynamics of the race have changed. I don't think that the odds have changed. We're pretty much where we were this time yesterday.
Isabel Hardman, was your popcorn out?
I think if I did have popcorn, I would have got through several bags with a sort of comfort-eating mechanism rather than through excitement. Tom's right, there wasn't a kind of breakthrough moment. I think there was some interesting lines from it. So Boris Johnson on the UK ambassador to Washington, for instance. Also, there was a sort of ominous line from Boris Johnson about a forthcoming election, which I think was the clearest indication we've had so far that he's going to put the country on a war footing. But the best line, and not in Jeremy Hunt's favour at all, was one that Jeremy Hunt produced where he said that Boris Johnson was peddling optimism, which he meant as an insult, but really I think that's probably what Boris Johnson's appeal to the Tory membership is at the moment. And he was characterising Jeremy Hunt as being defeatist by contrast.
Yes, let's just play that clip actually to hear it. I think we've got it ready.
Being Prime Minister is about telling people what they need to hear, not just what they want to hear. And the difference between you and me is you are peddling optimism, and I'm saying we can make a tremendous...
needs a bit of optimism,
Boris,
frankly.
why don't you... We can make...
I think...
It's an interesting thing because I suppose what he was going after there, Isabel, is that he was trying to say, you'll get reality with me. That's the whole thing. And it plays obviously into Boris Johnson's hand about the managerial approach having not worked. But actually... say how to fight populism isn't necessarily to be downbeat about it, which is also what some people learned during the referendum campaign.
It is very difficult to appeal to people if they're in the mood for someone who's not a realist. And I think that's where people are, not just in the Conservative Party, but more widely in politics at the moment. If we look at the 2017 snap election, when Theresa May started talking about how much money people were going to have to pay for social care, people got very upset because they'd actually rather have a party like Labour that was offering free university tuition and that sort of thing. I mean, why wouldn't you?
To bring you back in on this, Tom, I think I was just talking to Chris Philp before you joined me, a Boris Johnson supporter, Conservative MP, and he was defending that Boris Johnson's approach about standing by the US ambassador was the right one, not getting into some kind of slinging match. But at the same time, there has been criticism that he could have at least stood by the ambassador. You don't have to say anything against Donald Trump, but he could have been a bit stronger in that area. People do like loyalty, and he was Foreign Secretary, with him serving under him.
Yeah, I think what Boris said was that this is a decision for the British Prime Minister and it shouldn't be for anyone else. But he didn't want to tie his hands in terms of what's going to happen over the next weeks and months. And I think that's kind of the right position to strike, especially if you're someone expecting to take the job. Perhaps if you're less likely to win, if you need to make bolder gestures like Jeremy Hunt did, then you'd come down with a clearer position. But this sort of constructive ambiguity is something that really a potential Prime Minister should be engaging in right now.
Constructive ambiguity. We normally use that lovely phrase about the Labour Party, but there you go. We've heard it about Boris Johnson. I mean, I suppose, though, the pushback again to that would be is that Sir Kim Darroch is meant to be standing down very soon anyway. So he could have actually just said, of course I'll keep him in post until the end of it. Because if I remove him before that, then I have kowtowed to the US president, excuse me.
Well, it's not just the US president who's saying that perhaps some of our civil service is a little bit too Remainy, a little bit too dour, a bit too downbeat. That's a significant portion of the Conservative Party and Brexiteers within this country that are saying that too. So just because you want to change up the civil service a little bit, or the Foreign Office or whatever, isn't necessarily kowtowing to the Americans. That being said, there were some peculiar questions about it. For example, would he be kept beyond December when he was supposed to be resigning anyway? I think it was getting into a little bit of a farcical territory by the end of that discussion.
So you mentioned that forthcoming election, or rather Boris Johnson didn't, Isabel, you picking up on it there. I mean, what does that mean, war footing? What can we take from that?
Well, he has been dropping hints, and his supporters have been dropping hints, that they think that going to the country sooner rather than later would be a better plan. And Jeremy Hunt's argument is, no, doing that would be bad because it would let Jeremy Corbyn in. And again, this feeds into the Boris Johnson defeatist argument about Jeremy Hunt, which is basically he's saying if I were Prime Minister, I would lose to Jeremy Corbyn, which isn't a particularly appealing line to take to the Conservative membership. Whereas Boris Johnson's people say, well, we can beat Jeremy Corbyn because we've got the charisma and so on. And so they've got much more confidence about their ability to do this, and perhaps their need to do it as well, because then they would have a mandate to be able to do what they wanted, which is something that Theresa May sought but managed to sort of reverse.
Squander,
actually. Yes, exactly.
I mean, what do you make of Boris Johnson's style, Isabel, shouting over the top? I mean, regardless of whether people support Boris Johnson or like him or not, people always say to us as broadcasters, we hate it when people shout on top of each other. We can't hear what they're saying. It's really off-putting. Do you think that in any way, although he was having a good audience reaction on those optimism lines, and there was lots of laughter towards Boris Johnson, well-intentioned laughter a lot of the time, but do you think that is off-putting?
Yeah, I thought it was rude. I thought the way that he appeared actually to have forgotten how to stop talking. There were just sort of words that kept coming out of his mouth while Julie Etchingham, the debate moderator, was trying to stop him, and it made him appear quite wild and quite disrespectful, actually, given that she wasn't someone who was cutting them off every time they tried to say more than one sentence. She was a very fair moderator, and I think that gave us a glimpse of what Downing Street will be like with Boris Johnson at the helm. It probably will be quite wild, excitable, and potentially quite spiky towards journalists as well.
Wild. Right, there we go. A wild Downing Street. That's something to think about. I know, Tom, that you are a supporter of Boris Johnson, but did you sort of think, even watching it on playback, Boris Johnson, please just shut up for a minute. Learn how to stop when you're being asked politely to stop?
Well, I think it's unfair to just pin that on Boris. I think there were moments where Jeremy Hunt certainly sort of tried to chime in on the questions as if it was sort of the Jeremy Hunt show as well.
But it was quite striking.
Of course, when you're in a situation like that, surrounded by an audience, deep pressure, there are passionate moments, and that certainly came through. And I think that probably the wrong tone was struck on one or two of those. But overall, you saw the warm reaction that the audience gave. The, as you said, chuckling, laughter, and the amount of applause actually was really quite striking. Comparing it to the other debates that we've had in this contest, particularly the Channel 4 one, where there was a studio audience, and Boris wasn't there, the sort of audience reaction was a lot less warm. Whereas in this debate, what we found was there was a genuine warmth and well-wishing towards Boris from the audience of people who are previously Conservative supporters, likely to vote Conservative, and current Conservative voters.
Let me bring you both onto something that's only just happened in the last couple of hours or so. Sir John Major has intervened. He's told the Today programme that he would, on Radio 4, that he would be willing to go to court to block a new leader from delivering a no-deal Brexit by suspending Parliament. Let's have a listen.
The Prime Minister's advice to the Queen can, I believe, be challenged in law, and I, for one, would be prepared to go and seek judicial review to prevent Parliament being bypassed. I served in Parliament for over 20 years. I'm very proud to have done so. I have huge admiration for our parliamentary traditions. I'm not going to stand by and see them disregarded in this fashion.
Isabel, a source close to Boris Johnson has told the BBC's assistant political editor Norman Smith that Sir John has gone completely bonkers and has clearly been driven completely mad by Brexit. What do you make of this intervention? Do you believe him?
Well, I think this is another sign of the sort of culture war that's going on in the Conservative Party at the moment, and that there's going to be, whoever takes over, whether it's Boris Johnson or Jeremy Hunt, is going to have an almighty task on their hands of bringing the party back together and getting people to talk to one another and to respect one another. And that was always going to be difficult because of Brexit. And, John Major's comments show that people aren't going to respect the new leader or give them any breathing space at all.
What do you make of these comments? Do you believe him?
I just think it's really sad. We had John Major, someone who most people respected as a statesman, who actually it began in 2016 when he started to make these really quite vicious attacks against other Conservatives, breaking that thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Conservative.
Well, those two gentlemen last night didn't do very well on that when they were asked to give each other a compliment at the end, were they? Anyway, we'll come back to that.
But on John Major, it's an incredibly hypocritical, almost deranged attack, really. The man himself prorogued Parliament in the 1990s to get out of a Cash for Questions report being published. This is someone...
He denied that this morning.
It's there in Hansard.
He said he took the election to the absolute deadline point. But do carry on. I'm just reflecting what he said this morning.
Sure, I think he's being selective with his memory there. Really, what we're seeing is a total double standard. People who have been so knocked out of kilter by this referendum result. I think, thankfully, within the Conservative Party, it's a relatively small group. But Sir John Major is someone who has made some pretty outlandish interventions over the last few years, and this is really following in that strain of sort of the sort of Heseltinian view of the world.
Do you think it's outlandish to have proroguing Parliament though still on the table as an option if you have to try and get no deal through? Others would argue that side of things being outlandish.
I think it's quite right to keep everything on the table, especially when we've seen the unprecedented moves that Remainers in Parliament have made over the last couple of years. They've done extraordinary things going against all sort of precedent, whereas prorogation is something that has actually happened relatively frequently in Westminster-style parliaments around the world.
Do you have a take on this?
What? I mean, I'm not going to say what I sort of think about the wisdom of proroguing Parliament or not, but in terms of what it means for the party, I just think there's this massive chasm opening up between the two sides.
And this will be what whoever leads has to deal with when they get in.
Whoever leads, not just on prorogation, but on a whole host of issues, is that they don't want to understand each other anymore.
Will the Conservative Party stay together?
I've been talking to Tory MPs on the sort of Remainy side who are again talking about the prospect of a split. Now, firstly, they say, some MPs might leave and go to the Brexit party, but that won't happen if Boris Johnson becomes leader. And then they start talking about their own prospects and they say, well, we haven't really got anywhere to go, particularly since Change UK, the independent group.
I can't keep up with
God
what it's
knows
called.
what they're called.
No.
There's been another group launched today called the Independents with a little bracket.
I missed that.
It's nice, isn't it? They could go there.
Oh, right, OK, I must check this out. Thank you for flagging to all of us.
Group.
Just finally then, you say the odds haven't changed. Boris Johnson still the man going to get that top job after last night. Do you think he should have perhaps maybe gone for a compliment at the end instead of saying Jeremy Hunt was a flip-flopper?
I don't know. I think it was relatively cheeky but good-natured. It's the crux of the argument, really. What we've had for the last 3 years is someone who didn't vote for the referendum result, who didn't believe in it truly, who even in the 2017 election said that she couldn't bring herself to vote for it if there were a hypothetical second referendum. And I think what that line gets to is the crux of the argument that do we want a continuation of these last 3 years where you have someone who says that perhaps they believe in the result but they didn't vote for it and were never a champion for that project, versus someone who actually believes in it, who feels a very personal sense of responsibility to deliver it. I think that's the change that a lot of Conservatives want to see.
Isabel?
I thought it was a very sour moment from both men. They looked completely nonplussed at the idea that they might possibly be able to be generous to one another.
Yes, well, and do you think anything changed in terms of who's come out top? I mean, a lot of people have already cast their votes who have their votes. Do you think it's changed anything at all?
No, I don't think so. I think Boris Johnson probably had the slightly better pitch because he came across as optimistic.
Yes, that final phrase, which is very memorable. He does have a very good turn of phrase, even if you don't support his politics, when he said we need to get off the hamster wheel of doom. There we go. Well, who hasn't been on the hamster wheel of doom with us this morning, cheering us up? Isabel Hardman from The Spectator, Tom Harwood from Guido Fawkes. Thank you very much for your time. Your views are all coming in. I'm asking you if you're on team optimism or team realism, or perhaps team pessimism this morning. If neither of those two gentlemen float your boat, I'll come straight back to your messages in the moment. Slightly late to the news and sport. Forgive us for that. It's 10:34.